The people of Hollow Ridge never said the forest punished the Bell family. They only claimed the trees remembered every promise broken beneath their branches, and one autumn, they finally answered. Before we continue, subscribe to our channel to complete 1,000 subscribers, and tell in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it. In the autumn of 1905, tucked among the isolated ridges of central Appalachia, there stood a weathered farmhouse that seldom appeared on county maps. Locals referred to it simply as the Bell House, though official land records listed the property under the name of Margaret Bell, a widow whose influence extended far beyond the fences enclosing her fields. In an era when mountain families depended upon one another for survival through brutal winters and failed harvests, the Bells existed in deliberate isolation. They bought little from nearby settlements, attended church only a handful of times each year, and declined nearly every invitation that arrived from neighboring homesteads. Their absence gradually became accepted, then expected, until people stopped asking why no Bell child ever played beside the river with the others. Forgotten tax ledgers preserved inside the Clay County Courthouse reveal little about Margaret Bell beyond routine transactions involving timber rights and livestock. She paid every obligation on time. She disputed no property lines. She rarely appeared before local officials except to sign documents with an elegant, unwavering hand. Nothing within those records suggested disorder. Yet hidden among the correspondence of Sheriff Elias Monroe rests a single folded note written during the summer preceding the family's disappearance. The widow governs that house, it reads. No man speaks before she does. The remark carries no accusation, only concern. The sheriff never opened a formal investigation. Mountain communities possessed customs outsiders often misunderstood, and strict households were hardly uncommon across Appalachia at the turn of the 20th century. Still, Monroe preserved the note instead of discarding it, an unusual decision for an experienced lawman accustomed to separating rumor from evidence. The Bell property rested beyond Hollow Ridge, where dense forests swallowed narrow wagon roads and morning fog lingered long after sunrise. Travelers approaching the farm described towering chestnut trees casting long shadows across weathered fences. A narrow creek wound through the valley before disappearing beneath tangled laurel thickets. Even on warm afternoons, the place seemed wrapped in quiet that belonged more naturally to abandoned settlements than living farms. The first detailed description appears inside the diary of Reverend Nathaniel Pierce, a circuit preacher who visited scattered mountain families throughout eastern Kentucky and western Virginia. His journals survive only in fragments, several pages damaged by water and smoke, yet one autumn entry remains remarkably intact. Pierce arrived at the Bell House shortly before dusk. He expected hospitality common among isolated families, where strangers carrying news from neighboring valleys were welcomed despite modest means. Instead, he found every window shuttered. No smoke drifted from the chimney. Only after knocking 3 times did the front door open. Margaret Bell greeted him without visible surprise. She stood tall despite her advancing years, dressed entirely in dark clothing despite the lingering warmth of September. Witnesses later describe her eyes not as cold, but unusually patient, as though she measured every word before allowing silence to continue. She invited the minister inside. The house appeared immaculate. Wooden floors shone beneath lantern light. Every chair rested precisely beneath the table. Family portraits lined the walls, yet Reverend Pierce noticed something unsettling almost immediately. Each portrait faced slightly toward the staircase rather than the room itself. He never discovered why. Margaret explained that her sons remained occupied with evening chores and would not join supper. Pierce accepted the explanation politely. Still, throughout the meal he heard footsteps crossing the upper floor. Slow, measured, never hurried. Whenever he glanced toward the staircase, the sound stopped. His diary records no fear, only confusion. Later that evening he requested permission to conduct a brief family prayer before continuing his journey. Margaret declined. Her refusal surprised him more than any other moment of the visit. Even the most private mountain households rarely rejected such requests outright. She thanked him graciously, opened the front door herself, and watched until his horse disappeared into gathering fog. Several miles beyond the farm, Pierce paused beside the creek to adjust his saddle. As twilight settled over Hollow Ridge, he looked back toward the Bell property. A single lantern burned upstairs. Then another. Then another. The lights moved slowly from one window to the next as though carried through empty rooms by unseen hands. He counted 7 lanterns. County records, however, listed only 5 residents living within the house. Pierce mentioned the discrepancy during Sunday service the following week. No one answered. Instead, the congregation lowered their eyes until the conversation drifted elsewhere. Years later, while cataloging abandoned church archives, researchers discovered a folded sheet tucked inside the back cover of the minister's Bible. Written in faded ink were only 12 words. "If you hear knocking from the forest after sunset, never answer before Margaret Bell does." No signature followed. No explanation accompanied the warning. Only weeks later, the first member of the Bell family vanished, and the people of Hollow Ridge would later insist that on the very night it happened, the forest knocked first. Only weeks after Reverend Pierce's unsettling visit, the Bell household became the subject of quiet conversations that seldom traveled beyond Hollow Ridge. The people who lived among those mountains understood that rumors carried their own dangers. Families depended upon one another during floods, harsh winters, and failed harvests. Public accusations could divide an entire valley for generations. Even so, the disappearance of Margaret Bell's eldest son could not be dismissed as ordinary misfortune. His name was Samuel Bell. County tax records describe him as 28 years old, responsible for timber contracts and livestock accounts belonging to the family farm. He rarely visited town, yet merchants remembered him as courteous and remarkably reserved. Every purchase appeared deliberate. Salt, lamp oil, iron nails, flour, never unnecessary conversation. No one recalled him speaking against his mother, but neither did anyone remember him making decisions without first saying he would ask at home. The official explanation for Samuel's absence arrived 3 days after he vanished. Margaret informed Sheriff Elias Monroe that her eldest son had accepted temporary work with a logging crew operating farther north. Such arrangements were common throughout Appalachia, particularly before winter, when lumber companies paid experienced woodsmen generous wages to prepare timber camps. The explanation satisfied the sheriff. At first, weeks passed without a single letter. No wages arrived. The logging company Margaret named eventually responded to an inquiry stating they had never employed Samuel Bell. Monroe folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a growing file he had labeled simply, Bell Property. No formal investigation followed. Without evidence of a crime, there existed little authority for entering a private residence against the wishes of its owner. Autumn settled heavily across Hollow Ridge. Cold rain swept through the mountains for nearly 2 weeks without interruption. The narrow creek beside the Bell farm overflowed its banks, carrying broken branches and fallen leaves toward the valley below. Thick fog settled among the chestnut forests each morning, refusing to lift until afternoon sunlight finally pierced the gray silence. During those weeks, another witness came forward. Her testimony survives today only because it accompanied a property dispute filed years later in county court. Rebecca Sloan lived less than 2 miles from the Bell homestead. She admitted under oath that she frequently heard unusual sounds drifting through the woods after sunset. Not screams, not arguments, footsteps. Always measured. Always together. She described hearing several people walking slowly through fallen leaves beyond her property line long after darkness settled across the ridge. Whenever she stepped outside carrying a lantern, the footsteps ceased immediately. One evening curiosity overcame caution. Rebecca followed the sounds into the forest. The trail led toward the Bell property. Before reaching the fence, she noticed dozens of lanterns glowing faintly among the trees. She later insisted they were not hanging from branches. They moved. Slowly, as though carried by unseen travelers walking between the trunks. Believing neighbors were searching for lost livestock, she called out politely. No voice answered. Instead, every lantern stopped moving at exactly the same moment. Rebecca turned back without crossing another step. Years afterward, she confessed that the silence frightened her more than any reply could have. Sheriff Monroe interviewed her personally. His handwritten notes remain preserved inside the county archive. He recorded every detail carefully, then added one sentence beneath her statement. Observed no evidence of intoxication or hysteria. By early November, another inconsistency emerged. Mail addressed to the Bell family began returning unopened from the small post office serving Hollow Ridge. The postmaster, Isaac Turner, explained that Margaret herself had instructed him to hold all deliveries until further notice. Such requests occasionally occurred when families expected to spend weeks hunting or visiting distant relatives. Yet Turner found the arrangement unusual because someone continued collecting the mail every Thursday evening. He never saw who. The sack simply disappeared between sunset and dawn. Concern slowly spread among neighboring farms. Several women attempted friendly visits under the pretense of delivering preserves before winter. Each returned with identical accounts. Margaret accepted every gift graciously. She refused every invitation inside. Whenever asked about Samuel, she smiled faintly and answered only that her family remained exactly as it should. No visitor ever saw another member of the household. Then Reverend Pierce received an unexpected letter. Unlike ordinary correspondence, the envelope carried no return address. Its paper appeared unusually old, rough beneath his fingertips, as though stored for decades before being used. Inside rested a single folded page. No greeting. No signature. Only one carefully written sentence. The forest does not keep prisoners. Pierce compared the handwriting with church registers maintained throughout the county. Nothing matched. The ink itself puzzled him further. Local stationers later confirmed its brown color resembled homemade walnut ink no longer commonly prepared by 1905. He locked the letter inside his Bible beside the earlier warning. Snow arrived earlier than expected that year. Heavy drifts buried wagon roads crossing Hollow Ridge, isolating farms beneath white silence broken only by distant church bells carried through cold mountain air. On the first Sunday after the storm, Margaret Bell appeared at church for the first time in nearly 6 months. She came alone. Her black dress carried fresh snow across its hem. She greeted neighbors politely. She listened quietly throughout the sermon. When Reverend Pierce announced prayers for absent family members struggling through winter camps, Margaret lowered her head. Those seated nearby later swore they heard her whisper 6 words before the final hymn began. "They are no longer behind my door." No one understood what she meant. 3 nights later, the second Bell son disappeared. The second disappearance transformed quiet suspicion into something closer to collective unease. Hollow Ridge had endured floods, mining accidents, and winters harsh enough to isolate families for months, yet it had never grown accustomed to people simply dissolving from ordinary life without explanation. 2 grown sons had vanished from the Bell household within a single season. No graves marked their passing. No employers claimed them. No neighboring county recorded their arrival. It was as though the mountains themselves had erased every path they might have taken. Sheriff Elias Monroe reopened the file he had intended to leave unfinished. Inside lay Reverend Pierce's observations, Rebecca Sloane's sworn testimony, the letter from the logging company denying Samuel Bell's employment, and several unsigned notes delivered anonymously over recent weeks. Until then, each fragment appeared too weak to justify official action. Together they formed an unsettling pattern. Monroe decided to visit the Bell property once more. Heavy snow muffled every sound as he rode the narrow trail toward Hollow Ridge. The forest stood motionless beneath white branches, while wind carried fine powder across frozen fields. When the farmhouse emerged through drifting fog, it appeared unchanged. Smoke curled quietly from the chimney. Chickens wandered inside their enclosure. Firewood rested in careful stacks beneath the porch roof. Nothing suggested tragedy. Margaret Bell welcomed the sheriff without hesitation. She invited him inside, poured coffee, and answered every question with measured calm. Samuel, she insisted, remained employed elsewhere. Her second son, Nathaniel, had departed voluntarily to purchase livestock farther south before winter roads became impassable. Her explanations sounded reasonable. Yet Monroe noticed something impossible. 3 supper plates rested upon the dining table. Each contained fresh food. Steam still rose from one untouched bowl. He glanced toward the staircase. The upper floor remained silent. When he politely asked whether another family member expected to join them, Margaret looked toward the empty chair before answering. "They keep their own hours now." She offered nothing further. The sheriff left without making an arrest. But before mounting his horse, he walked slowly around the rear of the house where snowfall should have preserved every recent movement. Only one clear set of footprints led away from the back porch. They entered the forest. None returned. That evening Monroe compared his observations with forgotten property surveys stored in the county archive. While examining yellow deeds from the 1870s, he discovered an older map drawn decades before Margaret Bell inherited the farm. It revealed something omitted from every modern survey. Behind the Bell house, beyond the tree line, had once stood a narrow wagon road climbing toward an abandoned settlement called Briar Chapel. The road no longer appeared on contemporary maps. Curiously, neither did the settlement. The following week Reverend Pierce accompanied Monroe back into the archives. Together they searched church registers, probate files, newspaper fragments, and handwritten cemetery records. Briar Chapel had unquestionably existed. Baptisms had been performed there. Marriages recorded. Children buried beneath weathered stones. Then, sometime during the late 1870s, every official reference simply stopped. No fire. No epidemic. No legal dissolution. The community vanished from public record without explanation. Folded inside an old church register, they found a brittle letter addressed to the pastor of Briar Chapel but never mailed. The writer remained anonymous. Its final sentence caught both men immediately. The woods keep returning those who refuse to leave in peace. No one understood what it meant. Encouraged by the discovery, Monroe organized a careful search of the forgotten road before another snowstorm buried it completely. 2 deputies, Reverend Pierce, and 3 experienced woodsmen followed the faint trace climbing through dense forests west of the Bell property. The farther they walked, the quieter the mountains became. Birdsong disappeared. Even the wind seemed reluctant to enter the valley. Near sunset they reached the remains of Briar Chapel. Only stone foundations survived. Collapsed cabins lay beneath vines and moss. An ancient church stood without a roof, its bell tower leaning dangerously above broken pews scattered across the frozen ground. Everything suggested decades of abandonment. Yet fresh footprints crossed the snow. Not many. Just 1 pair. They led directly through the ruined church. Inside, Monroe found no missing sons. No hidden prisoners. Instead, he discovered something stranger. Hundreds of handwritten pages covered the floor. Diaries. Family letters. Court petitions. Birth records. School notebooks. Some dated back 40 years. Others appeared only weeks old. Each document belonged to families from Hollow Ridge. Every page described lives controlled by fear, silence, or obedience. Many mentioned Margaret Bell's household. None accused her of violence. Instead, they spoke of something far older. A belief that every generation surrendered freedom to preserve a promise made long before anyone still living had been born. At the center of the ruined sanctuary rested a weathered wooden chest. Inside lay dozens of sealed envelopes. Each bore the name of a different mountain family. One remained unopened. Across its front someone had written, in faded brown ink, to be opened only when the forest finally answers. As Monroe reached for the envelope, the abandoned church bell above them moved once in the still winter air. No wind stirred the trees. Yet a single hollow toll echoed across the silent mountains. And somewhere deep beyond the ruined chapel, footsteps began moving slowly through the snow. The hollow bell continued to echo long after its single toll faded into the snow-covered ridges. Sheriff Elias Monroe stood motionless inside the roofless chapel, one hand resting upon the weathered chest while Reverend Nathaniel Pierce slowly turned toward the dark tree line. No wind disturbed the branches. No birds crossed the pale winter sky. Yet the footsteps beyond the ruined church continued at an unhurried pace, circling the clearing without ever revealing the traveler who made them. The deputies raised their lanterns. Their light reached only the nearest pines before dissolving into drifting fog. Monroe finally lifted the unopened envelope from the chest. Across the brittle paper, beneath the faded inscription, another sentence had been written so lightly it was nearly invisible. When the promise is broken, the forest returns every name that was borrowed. Inside rested a folded land deed dated 1838. It bore the signatures of 13 founding families from Hollow Ridge, including the earliest known ancestor of Margaret Bell. Attached to the deed was a private covenant never entered into county records. According to the document, the families had agreed to conceal the existence of Briar Chapel after a devastating winter in which dozens of settlers disappeared while attempting to cross the mountains. Rather than abandon the valley entirely, they erased the settlement from official maps, divided its remaining land among neighboring farms, and swore that no future generation would reclaim the abandoned ground. They believed the place carried a grief so profound that every attempt to rebuild it invited further loss. The covenant was not supernatural. It was born from fear. For decades, each generation renewed the promise through handwritten letters stored inside the chapel chest. Every family kept one sealed copy, passing the responsibility quietly from parent to child. Most descendants gradually forgot why the agreement existed. They remembered only that certain paths beyond Hollow Ridge were never to be followed after sunset, and certain questions about Briar Chapel were never to be asked. Margaret Bell remembered more than most. After inheriting the family farm, she became guardian of the final surviving copy of the covenant. Believing the old promise alone protected the valley from repeating its darkest winter, she isolated her household from neighbors, discouraged her children from leaving the ridge, and quietly collected every surviving diary, letter, and record connected to Briar Chapel before curious outsiders could rediscover them. What others mistook for cruelty had grown from a lifetime spent carrying a burden she believed belonged to her family alone. But her sons had not shared that belief. Samuel uncovered the original deed hidden beneath loose floorboards inside the farmhouse. Nathaniel later discovered correspondence revealing that no legal authority required the covenant to continue. Together, they chose to leave Hollow Ridge, determined to deliver the forgotten records to the county courthouse where history could no longer be concealed. They had not vanished. They had simply walked away from the silence. Weeks after leaving, they quietly settled in neighboring counties under their own names, helping local historians identify abandoned cemeteries and restore forgotten property records connected to Briar Chapel. Because communication across the mountains remained slow, news of their whereabouts had not yet reached Hollow Ridge. The mystery that consumed the valley had been sustained less by disappearance than by distance, isolation, and generations of secrecy. Sheriff Monroe carried every recovered document back to the courthouse. Professor Charles Winfield, a state archivist visiting the region the following spring, spent months comparing the Bell papers with land surveys, church registers, tax rolls, family letters, and newspaper fragments scattered across eastern Appalachia. Piece by piece, Briar Chapel returned to the historical record. The abandoned cemetery was carefully marked. Forgotten names appeared once again in county archives. Children whose births had existed only inside fading family Bibles were finally entered into official registries. A settlement that history had nearly erased reclaimed its place among the mountain communities that shaped the region. Margaret Bell never opposed the investigation. When Monroe visited her one final time, she handed him the last journal remaining inside the farmhouse. "I spent my life guarding the past," she reportedly told him. "Perhaps it belongs to everyone now." She died quietly the following winter. The Bell farmhouse stood empty for several years before another family restored it. Travelers passing through Hollow Ridge still pointed toward the old road leading into the forest, though few remembered exactly why it had once been avoided. The ruined church of Briar Chapel gradually became little more than weathered stone beneath towering trees, visited occasionally by historians carrying notebooks instead of lanterns. Yet one small mystery refused to disappear. During restoration work in 1932, workers repairing the chapel foundation discovered an iron box sealed beneath the altar. Inside lay 12 family covenants. The 13th was missing. No record has ever explained where it went. Even today, archivists comparing the recovered papers occasionally notice faint pencil marks on the reverse of one surviving map. The handwriting has never been identified with certainty, though many believe it belongs to Margaret Bell herself. It contains only a single sentence. Some promises end when they are spoken aloud. Others wait patiently until someone remembers why they were made. If this forgotten story found you tonight, let it linger a little longer with a like, and let your subscribe keep these quiet echoes alive.